word. The word became, first there was word, and then word became flesh. I don't understand. I don't understand it at all. So maybe if you could give some clarification around that.
It was Swami Vivekananda who really brought this Sankhya psychology, cosmology, and Vedanta together. So I have to explain what that means. Don't forget, he was speaking in Western countries where these concepts were also very strange. But in Christianity, we already have this concept of logos. And in Neoplatonism, we already have this understanding of logos, which can varyingly mean either intelligence, or it can mean, and has been interpreted to mean, word. That means in your own namesake, that is the Gospel of John, we have this outstanding prologue that we don't find anywhere else in Christian texts. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt amongst us. There's a very profound philosophical opening to a gospel. Gospel really meaning good news. So what was the good news? Now, if you exclude an exclusivist reading about it, you say the good news was about some internal subtle entity, the kingdom of heaven, and therefore the prologue must really be in connection with that. Now, if we talk about, or talk in the language of ruling kings, bearing in mind in Jesus' time, there was a Roman domination, and there was an emperor rather than a king with a broader scope than that, with wide territories ruling over an empire. And Jesus was involved in that political era where the Jews were under this domination. It's quite apt that we bring up the Jews and Judaism, because this evening in Ireland, the Jewish community are commemorating the Holocaust. Actually, officially, Wednesday is United Nations International Holocaust Commemoration. And we'll see if we can connect these various ideas, because if we remember that, and we remember also this aspect of the Word manifesting and becoming dwelling amongst us, then the two become contradictory. They become poles apart in terms of concepts. Now we can interpret the Word in John's Gospel theologically. We can say that there was somewhere some cosmic balancing mind, some cosmic balancing concern that enters into our world and corrects all the aberrations that we find. In which case, if this lasts for a long time, 2,000-3,000 years, we won't really, if we understand it correctly, we won't get an aberration in human behavior that decides to take 6 million people of a certain religion or ethnic persuasion, and in addition to that, cause the cost of lives of another additional 11 million people. Overall, 17 million people gone through herding humanity, people like cattle, into the most appalling conditions, concentration camps, and then systematically using those who are able to work and use their physical muscle, or be of some practical use in some other way, and the rest ruthlessly dispose of, labeling these people vermin. Supposing we take another approach, supposing we understand that what is meant by John's prologue, in the beginning was the Word. First of all, we have to see what do we mean by beginning, and we have to take the Judeo-Christian text seriously. And that means we go back to a Genesis account of how the world came to be. And that begins with in the beginning. So it says that there was some beginning in terms of time. What was that beginning? Well, it's termed a creation and a creation event. Yesterday, we talked at some length about cosmology in maybe overlaid terms, that is, terms which may be not easy to understand. So let us try and simplify what we mean. Every religion will talk of some kind of beginning. The Vedanta philosophy, in terms of cosmology, in terms of psychology, comes back only to Sankhya. 6 systems or darshanas are there in the overall Indian philosophical system. And the Sankhya system and the yoga system are the obverse and reverse of the same coin. They are twinned together. They are very similar in their philosophies, slightly different in their concepts. So Swami Vivekananda, in dealing with these difficult things, these new ways of looking at things in the West, sometimes in his hurry, interchanged terms. Because the Vedanta has one understanding of some of the terms, and the Sankhya, which is a dualistic philosophy, and yoga has maybe a slightly different understanding in it. And Swami Vivekananda overlaps the two things, plus he's dealing with the science of his day, and he's not, technically speaking, a scientist. Still, he has enough grasp of the scientific concepts of his day to make some sense to the average person using a system of science and logic to convince the people of his day that Vedanta is the very highest conclusion in the human way of trying to understand what we have in front of us. And highest means the most unifying. What would be the most unifying understanding that we have? So everything has to be brought to a unity. We all think that we have our own individual mind. And Western dualism encourages this, and modern psychology encourages this, encourages individualism. It is said that culturally, Western culture is more orientated toward individuals, and Eastern culture more orientated toward communal concerns, community. And so introducing these unitive terms is revolutionary, and is still revolutionary, in order to make some sense of the atrocities that occurred toward the Jewish people and those other people who are not deemed fit according to the distorted understanding of Nazism in Germany during the 1930s, 1940s. We have to find out what is that aspect of unity that makes humanity equal, all humans equal. Right now, we are getting close to this understanding of equality in principle, in ideology, but in practice, we are a long way from understanding it. And it begins with our own understanding of who are we. And so it's common practice to think that we have a body, individual and separate from anything else, a mind, individual and separate from anything else. But is it really so? And what is the Vedanta conclusion on it if he wants to bring everything back to unity? Now, the Sankhya approach also brings things to some kind of unity in terms of nature. This term Prakriti in Sankhya language is pretty equivalent to the English word nature. And nature, we don't think of nature as an all-encompassing universal thing necessarily. In common parlance, we look outside, we look at trees, we look at flowers in the park, and we say, isn't nature wonderful? somehow excluding ourselves from it. But really we can't do that. We have to include everything that lives and moves and breathes. We have to incorporate the whole range of our perception, as now in modern days extended through modern technology, through telescopes and through microscopes. It wasn't so long ago we wouldn't have had any clue or understanding of three important things now. One is that in a tiny, tiny square portion on the skin, put under an electron microscope, becomes a city, a whole country, if you will, of squirming entities, surviving entities living on the skin. Some of them are mites, which are small enough to see under a relatively average kind of microscope, but other populations will be there. Under an electron microscope, we'll see bacteria. 1 micron in length, half a micron in width, and sometimes of a round dimension, but broadly speaking, the same kind of dimensional attributes are there. 1 micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. You can't see it with the naked eye, beyond our range of perception. Well, if you take a small hair from the upper cheek, normally not visible, chop it into 1,000 portions, put it under the same electron microscope, you'll see the internal structure of a cell. What is popularly known as this interwoven structure called deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, in which is suspected to be over 100,000 coded messages, filling halls and halls of library textbooks if you were to decode them and put them into books. Maybe 1,000 encyclopedic being has, from a fern, a small plant, green plant, to now, every single part of organic life has this organic structure, this nucleic structure, this inner central nucleus of a cell called DNA. Biological evolutionists use this to trace back a unity of origin. Origin of the species is what Darwin put out. How can everything be traced back to one thing? Well, physically, we can trace everything back to this nature, Prakriti. So the Sankhyas managed to put everything into one thing, and the Vedantists don't disagree. Because Vedanta, classically called Uttaramimamsa, as one of the 6 philosophies in the Indian system, encompasses within it 3 other dimensions, 3 other points of view. And in terms of psychology and cosmology, none of the systems are in disagreement with Sankhya. Sankhya, Swami Vivekananda says, Kapila, the originator of Sankhya, is really some, say, 3,000 years older, is really essential as a foundation for all philosophies, be they Eastern or Western, because it brings back this unity of understanding. But the Sankhya philosophers weren't generous enough, having put the whole of nature under one heading called Prakriti. They weren't generous enough to put every life monad under one thing. Vedanta does it. So it says that we all have this individual jiva, and we all have this individual purusha. That means a self. At the fundamental core, something is there that not moving makes other things move, makes the nature itself operate. Now Vedanta says, well, why don't you put everything under one generous thing? And so let us make one entity. But the cosmos already is one entity, because this Prakriti, this nature, is seen to be structured like a person. The Jains actually give a visual aspect to this. Jain philosophy is a paradoxical philosophy in the Indian system. That is, it does not recognize the authority of the Vedas. Orthodox and heterodox in this ancient Indian system has nothing to do with belief in God or not. It is simply to do with, do you believe in the authority of the Vedas? You can be an atheist and still believe in the authority of the Vedas. And Sankhya is basically an atheistic system. Yoga philosophy is barely theistic, only attributing to the name or the word Ishvara something that, some entity that is a very ancient teacher, particular kind of practices that will, in very great detail, in a refined way, purify the mental field of the mind. Our whole problem is psychological because in front of us is a psychologically devised universe. And where does the psychology come from? It comes, according to the Sankhya's, from some origin that is called Mahat. Mahat, a great one. And here's where terms can get confusing. But for simplicity's sake, let us say that John's in the beginning was the word, and this Mahat are identical. They are the same thing. And why should it be called something that is huge, great, something that is enormously great and large? This Mahat, this great one, is because from it comes everything else. It's a creative principle. So Vivekananda, from this Mahat, sometimes labeled cosmic mind, is the origin of all consciousness. Now we have to be careful about the term consciousness, because the Sankhya's by consciousness do not mean the Vedantic Sat Chit Ananda. In modern day translations, we find these words consciousness, and to make a distinction, to make it subjective, they distinguish it by the word pure consciousness. Or they couple it with these other two terms, existence, consciousness, and bliss. So this is not this consciousness that we're talking about. This is a kind of cosmic self-awareness, and so we come across this term essentially ahamkara. This sense of I-ness, this cosmic self-awareness. I was starting to talk about the Jains. They give a physical structure to this, so that they say that it is something like a person. A person has broad shoulders on the upper part, narrows at the waist, and then goes broader toward the end. So they think that the cosmos is something like that. Curiously enough, if you look at the way this is structured and put it on its side, in other words, something that is going from left to right, broadening, starting from a beginning, broadening, you see this broadening is something like the Jain concept of a person. Let's put it vertically and you see something like a human entity there. This they conceive of as a cosmic person. And so as with any person, you'll expect, if you compare it to the human physique, it will have a body. There'll be legs, there'll be arms, there'll be a torso, there'll be a chest, there'll be a neck, there'll be a head, there'll be eyes, there'll be ears. You can conceive of the whole universe, which we call nature, in the same way. And that means there has to be some mind. And we don't care if you think the mind is brain or mind, some other entity. Swami Vivekananda took great pains to point out that mind was as material as the physical. It's more subtle, no doubt, and therefore more causal. Now, if the mind is more causal, then on a cosmic basis, the mind is a creative principle. This Mahat is a creative principle. Now we come across some confusing terms because often this is called buddhi. But the Sankhya's don't mean buddhi in the sense that the Vedantins mean. From the Sankhya point of view, buddhi now comes to the individual discriminated faculty. Let's look at it this way. If we are to understand our world around ourselves, then, and we consider the psychology that is there, we will find that two terms meaning two different things. Chitta, the Vedantins mean not something like a mental field that gets impacted by impressions. So let us stick with the Sankhya definition in psychology. Some kind of chitta is there, some kind of mind stuff. Now let us mix a few concepts for ease of understanding. Supposing this mahat, this potential creative entity, its first expression is in the Vedic sense called vak. That is a word that is emanating from it. That makes sense. If you have a mind, then there are concepts in the mind, pictures. And pictures and words have to go together. You can never have a word without a corresponding concept. If you say elephant, an elephant appears in the mental field. You can see it inwardly. And so this elephant has two aspects to it. One aspect is the concrete elephant. We can hear how it makes its elephant sound. We can see how its trunk can go up or down or left or right and curve this way and that. We can see it eating grass and leaves and twigs and branches. We can see it eating bananas. We can see it cooling itself with its ears. All of these we can note physically. But away from the elephant, when somebody says elephant, you can reconstruct that picture in your mind. It doesn't mean to say the head is big enough to contain an elephant. So clearly, literally speaking, the brain does not contain the concepts, literally, physically. There's a subtle variation of it that we call name, nama. The gross portion being rupa, form. A gross portion, physical portion is there. A subtle version is there in the mental field. So in that same way, if we inflate this idea, if we extrapolate our human experience to the cosmic experience, we say that this nature, physical nature, meaning the whole of the universe, has a mind, and the first expression is a vak, a word. Almost parallel passages in the Vedas. In the beginning was the word. Almost parallel passages are there. That the first expression has to be this original idea. And ideas, concepts, are creative things. And they have a function, a creative function. Now from there we can find two components arising. We can call it akasha and prana. Now these are Vedantic terms. These are not Sankhya terms. But in order to understand this, we have to take all the terms and concepts available and see if we can carefully match them up without creating any confusion. Now let's put some modern terms to these things. See, akasha is almost a negative term, but essentially it means matter. And prana means energy. Swami Vivekananda didn't express it like that. He put akasha as matter, but he took prana as force because the whole term energy was not current in his day. Force implies today some mechanical force issued from an issuer onto some objective thing. Energy is understood now in a different way. Energy can be kinetic. Energy can produce some work. So force is to do with work, but energy is understood in a different way. And energy and prana are really equivalent terms. The thing that makes something else move, this is what we call energy. It has a number of variations. It can be potential, it can be kinetic, it can be radiational. It can be liquid, it can be solid. It can be electrical, it can be magnetic. And the ancient philosopher scientists of the ancient world understood these 5 variations. They only left out one, we can say one modern discovery, which has been divided up, and that is strong and weak nuclear forces, which really at the end of the day may well be variations of electricity and magnetism. And the only difference that the modern world has made to these ancient scientific discoveries, which have their energy equivalents, is they combined 2 things, electricity and magnetism, and called it the electromagnetic field. So these subtle things, these subtle energies, combinations of matter and energy in its potential form, really create the universe that we have. And so the first emanation is Akasha and Prana. And when we shorten it to conform really to the Sankhya system, we call it Akasha. Now nature also, this Prakriti, has another term which can be used. It can be avyakta, the thing that is not classified. Swami Vivekananda puts this as a more scientifically technical description of what is there, because it's a negative term. It's something that is not classified, something that is not made manifest. And so he's fond of using those terms. So this unmanifest has within it various components, various potential forces or energies waiting in the wings. And these we know as gunas. They are not exactly qualities, as is generally understood, because today it snowed here, and snow is white. But if you ask white, behind me is a white board, so there has to be white something, white snow, white board, white sugar, white rice. So something has to go with it, and that something has to have also a function. But generally, we understand the gunas to be, in a psychological way, we can describe them by their effects. Typical way of describing the effects of sattva guna is something that gives a pleasurable feeling. Rajas, we can say something that gives a painful reaction. And we can say that tamas is something that is indifferent to both of these things. But if we see them as materials rather than qualities, then we have something different. We have sattva having manifested in the physical world, having the effect of equilibrium, balance. We have rajas as having the effect of activity. And we have the tamas as typifying the inertness of something. And so we can see that this is rajas and tamas has a dynamic aspect to it of attraction and repulsion. And our strategy in life is wavering between these 3, occasionally bringing in sattva. When we bring in sattva, we now regulate the more pain-bearing aspects, which are called rajas and tamas. So that the whole of spiritual life is promotion of sattva. Sattva, these properties that give us pleasurable feelings which have equilibrium in them. The senses, no doubt, register pleasurable feelings, but there's no equilibrium in it. So the equilibrium really comes in the mental construct of it, in strategically cultivating these properties that give us an equilibrium of mind. It has a neutralizing effect on the other 2 wave systems, rajas and tamas. And for this reason, we are constructing something that is harmonizing and balancing. If we take the Sankhya idea of Everything is to do with the psychology. When we, in a psychological way, induce, produce, and cultivate pure qualities that have no egoistic input, strength and beauty and goodness and love and harmony, we now are on a journey back toward this cosmic mind or this initial word. And so now we can bring in another dimension. That if one of these methods, these sattvic methods, is love of God, then the highest registered God will be this cosmic mind. Now we can bring in, instead of a psychological dimension, a physical dimension, we're also bringing in a theological dimension. So this word is God. Now we understand John's prologue much better. In the beginning was this creative aspect called word, and the word was with God. That is, there's a higher entity which itself acts as an equilibrium wherein all these evolutionary forces are kept in potential. And the word was with God, and the word was God. See? And that became flesh and dwelt amongst us, not just as a special avatar, some entity descending from it and manifesting from it and having some balancing input to the time and the place that it arrives in, lasting as a giant wave for several thousand years with its influence. But we can see that the whole of the rest of nature comes from it. The whole of the manifestation of matter and energy comes from it. And when, at the end of the day, it arrives physically and psychologically as a human entity, we can trace all this back to one origin, word. In the beginning was the word, and the word was with God, and the word was God, and the word became flesh, and not only we can add dwelt amongst us, but dwelt through us, in us, and as us. Because in the system there's only one entity. We have to bring everything back to unity. Why should we think that all humans are equal when we see inequality everywhere? It is because when we look carefully, it traces itself back to this one entity, this cosmic mind. So this Akasha then, this unmanifest, which is also another variation of Vyakta, that is not manifest in ways which are distinguished with the sense organs of ears and eyes and so on, then starts combining, compounding. We can consider it something like a wave system, so subtle we cannot pick it up. And from subtlety arises something else. From this potential energy arises kinetic energy. We call this technically Vayu. And from this kinetic energy, that is prana acting on this basic material, Akasha, this Rupa side of things, interacts and combines in certain proportions. Then we have the next thing. The next thing is any movement, any increase in activity will produce pressure. This pressure, and the pressure, of course, comes from Vayu. We know that Vayu, loosely translated sometimes as air has a pressure aspect to it. Atmospheric pressure. Atmospheric pressure by the sea, but sea level is very different from atmospheric pressure at a certain height when the altitude increases. So this atmospheric pressure, as it were, then creates some friction. And this friction naturally produces heat. And we have our next component, that is Agni, Tejas, the thing that shines. Unfortunately translated in English as fire. And this then combines, because the next stage then will be electricity, electrical activity. And from there will come magnetism. variously called Api or Jala and Prithivi, earth. These English translations are useless in our understanding. They don't really help us. So we have to understand really what they actually mean. Now, that's not the end of the story, because these are still very subtle waves. These are tanmatras. And central to this understanding will be all these manifested combinations that we classify under one heading, this prakriti. Prakriti, literally the thing that is rough and unrefined. Because something has to shift for it to exist. This avyakta, this unclassified and unclassifiable, this unknown entity, because we can't grasp it easily, not even with scientific instruments, waits in potential and firstly manifests as this great mahat. And if we didn't find evidence for this in our psychology, we would have to abandon these grand concepts, because our psychology, our mental makeup would have to echo exactly what is there. And it does. So when we talk of manas, or when we talk of the mind as such, in the Sankhya understanding of it, this chitta is something like a mind stuff. And the first impact that it has, the first ripple, the first wave, is described as manas. It has a function. It is a function of reflecting, absorbing, gathering inwards. And then we come to another port of call, another eruption. There has to be some reaction to the impressions that have come in. And the determining factor in it is called buddhi. And then this buddhi will have to have some kind of self-awareness to it about the processing. And this is called ahamkara. Ahamkara, Sankhya term, Sankhya and Yoga term. Ahamkara. And the whole thing is coming under the heading of this antakarana, an internal instrument. And this ahamkara, the sense of I, in Vedanta philosophy is called jiva. That means that there is some entity that sits there behind. This is called Atman. Atman, literally self. The assumption that the rest was the self, that the mind was the self, that the body was the self. This is essentially our mistaken identity. And through spiritual practice, through discernment, for understanding these principles in the Vedanta, and through the practice, which we call yoga, we can now discern things and find out, aha, there I am, in the depths of mystic experience, where this truth is revealed by itself. And this revelation, this mystic experience, brings us to another cognizant level. It brings us to a higher level of consciousness that Swami Vivekananda is keen to call super consciousness. And it is this super consciousness in this realm of unfolding, deliberately and specifically cultivated. I mention that because Swami Vivekananda also mentions the accident of stumbling across it. Went through various circumstances, maybe in reflective mood, maybe where we have some difficulties and problems, sitting alone perhaps in a cave on a hill. Some experience comes to us, and because of our lack of training, we interpret it as something coming from outside instead of something coming from inside. Something like an angel visited me, or some spirit came to me, or something like that. Some vision was there that stirred me internally and led me in an inspirational way to share this with others and maybe make a reformation of existing circumstances. Swami Vivekananda makes this distinction between this kind of prophet and the yogis. He goes as far as saying that Muhammad, peace be upon him, was actually a prophet of that type, that he stumbled across this, and for that reason didn't have the equilibrium necessary to interpret this as an internal revelation. And because of this, much of the product from it, or the effect from this, had maybe some less fortunate circumstances for others. Now, supposing we don't know any of this, supposing we don't know the unity behind the whole of humanity, supposing we don't know our origin comes from this word or cosmic mind, then we would resort to individualism. We would resort to cultural superiority, ethnic superiority, linguistic superiority, and we will then start asserting it. And this we can call egoism. And when you extend it to a national movement, it is simply egoism spread. And this kind of egoism spread will be responsible for terrible, terrible atrocities, mankind on mankind. In my own lifetime, and yours too, we have come across such terrible atrocities. But many people are just geographically distant from such things, and therefore psychologically also distant from things. Now, I come from the continent of Africa, and I have seen many, many atrocities, and have been close to many atrocities. Don't think they're finished. As I'm speaking, atrocities are occurring. Man's inhumanity against man. As if it were not enough that in the last century, 2 world wars were there, taking over 20, 30 million people. Lives all finished, destroyed. So today we can easily understand, just from news broadcasts, the various hotspots in the world, the areas of difficulty. In Ireland itself, a whole classification called the Troubles is there, a kind of understatement of some of the traumatic events that occurred on this very island of Ireland. And then, of course, we have Yemen. We have the plight of refugees worldwide. So it hasn't stopped. This sense of individuality, the sense of jealousy, the sense of ownership, the sense of a prophet-actor complex that we call I, hasn't finished and will not finish as long as we don't know the lofty message of this Vedanta, a message of complete unity on every level. Let us take the remarkable work that this new kind of Vedanta has injected, this new enthusiasm. Firstly, it's harmonized practices. All the yogas are there in harmony. It has united the whole of humanity by bringing out the oneness of our divinity. It has put in enough generosity to say, let there be differences in practice. The more the better, because we're constitutionally all different. We should not try all to be one and the same. We are one and the same at the root level, at the source level, not at the expression level. What a dull world it would be if it was all like that. What a terrible world it would be if all flowers were red, if there was no greenery anywhere. In the Enneagram and Essence of Truth that we do, I give a standard meditation, going to upper mountain, arriving at different terraces, and the terrace you have to think of as all only one color. We can hardly stay on that for very long. We have to have this wonderful variety. These rainbow colors, these 7 aspects of the spectrum, visual spectrum, is necessary for us. Without that, there's no real variety, but we have to see how all these rainbow colors come together as white light. They're just divergent because of various angles of perception. When you shift the angle of perception, they rise above the cloud, and there, no rainbow is there, no weather is there, only the sun beaming there. So I often say, make this example. Is there a rainbow or is there not? Well, from a certain angle with the light reflected or refracted off raindrops, certainly there's an appearance of a rainbow. But as soon as you shift the angle and go above the cloud and rise above it, transcend it, then that rainbow is gone. It's only white light which is there. The sun beaming, no weather. The clouds below, you take an airplane ride, the clouds are below, and only blueness of the sky is there, and maybe the hint of the curvature of the earth, and the sun shining. So we have to learn to take these trips to cosmic mind and beyond, and understand that all of this that we call nature, in the Vedic language, from Brahma, that is this very cosmic mind, to a clump of grass, is all encompassed in this term, Prakriti, nature. But the origin is like that, some thought arising and then expressing itself in combinations and variations. I decided that this week's talk should be with a whiteboard because if you were all here sitting, then I won't normally resist going to the whiteboard and laying this out. So for completeness sake, I might just lay out the geography of this cosmology according to the Sankhya system with an addition of the Vedanta concepts with it. So let us see what we can do before we close off. So I hope you can all see me. I think you can. I'll just change this a little bit here. That's it. Better. All right. So we begin with this Prakriti. And we use the technical term avyakta. Because this is unmanifest, this is unclassified. Its first expression is this great thing called Mahat. Now we can add additional Vedantic terms to it. We can add the term, for example, Hiranyagarbha. A golden seed or a golden womb. Garbha, a kind of womb from which everything comes. And these concepts then we can use masculine and feminine terms. We can say nature, Mother Nature. So this is nature in all its potentiality and capacity to express. This Mahat, cosmic mind, I use a stronger red here. That's it. Cosmic mind. Now let's add some other terms. Logos. Word. The first word that comes out. And it expresses itself as Akasha. And it gets acted on by prana. Because if you have nothing acting on this, it just remains. So energy and matter are there. And this is remarkably advanced because modern science also bifurcates everything into energy and matter, but resolves everything to the moving aspect. So really, this first movement is a mental movement, cosmologically speaking, a mental movement. And it's the mental movement that then crystallizes as matter. You can't really separate the two. All you can say is that this prana is subtle and this akasha is less subtle. And then this movement here will produce the next thing that would be called technically Vayu, and that moves to, we can call it Api, you can call it Agni, And then that comes to Api, and that comes to Pradiri. Like that. Uselessly translated as ether, air, fire, water, earth. The only thing these ancient people never added was nuclear forces. And these are simply expressions. These are not separate things. All of these can be resolved backwards this way to here. And meditation does that. It takes us from the outside world here and takes us progressively through each one of these stages until we come to this cosmic mind. And then, if you're doing this through theological concepts, or in practice, bhakti, which is really the easiest path we can follow, love of God, then we will then revalue these things. Instead of calling these subtle elements of tanmatras, we can call these angels. These angels are God's graces. And so these angels here, God's angels doing his work for him, coming back to this cosmic mind, which we now can call God. God the Creator, and also when the Word becomes flesh, even at its origin, God the Son also in the Christian Trinity. And what is moving it is prana, God the Holy Spirit. Now we have some logic to the Christian theology of Trinity. So I think we'll leave it at there. And because it's now 7 minutes past 12. And so I'm much more at home with the whiteboard now. So this is because we have a new hall. So I'm able to do this. All right. So I think we'll leave it there, unless anybody has a final small question.
Swami, quick question there. Just when you were describing at the bottom that that we are outside, by meditation, going subtler and subtler, coming back into the cosmic mind. Who is it that is off at that stage?
Okay.
Is it the thoughts, or is it who's looking?
This is our attitude. We put this ourselves here, I. That's our beginning attitude. That means we start off by putting God outside. God is an outsider. God is a foreigner. And so we begin our religious practice invariably, many religions begin like this, thinking either blatantly or subtly that I am here and God is there. I'm standing here, I'm looking around, I'm here, where is God? But as this becomes more and more systematically trained, as more spiritual discipline and practice takes place, as prayer increases, as spiritual practice increases, this outsider comes inside. Then God is inside everything. But ultimately, as that progresses, this boundary goes away. You get the idea?
Yeah. That's okay. Yeah, the boundaries of the conceptions about who you are. Yeah,
the boundary between what we dualistically call God and myself, that falls away.
Yeah.
So the boundary that we put the boundary first. So this becomes our sense of I. Is a big obstacle. But the first thing typically we do is we say, well, I'm here, let's put God there. And then if I'm in trouble, I bring him out every Sunday. Or whenever there's a difficulty, bring him out. I'll beg for some assistance and help. And when that's concluded, put him in and behave in different ways in the meantime. But at some stage or other, Prakriti has one great characteristic. It pinches us with pain because its two components of Rajas and Tamas will produce pain. These are pain-bearing things for us. And so we are then inspired to look in a different direction. When we're inspired to look into a different direction, then, of course, we move away from that and start understanding, oh, I see, actually, worship becomes a question of noticing some divine energy or some divine presence within everything, working from within. And at that point, of course, we bring that God within us. And then we cultivate that because we start seeing God not only inside us, but we start seeing God in every being, in every person, in every place, in every event. Then we have great faith because that faith is based on a realization of God's presence everywhere. And then we cultivate a practice of the presence of God. And as that develops, automatically, this defining line that isolates this I and every other entity gradually becomes more of a dotted line, becomes more vague. And then ultimately we find, oh, there's one unity of existence. And this then is the pinnacle of the Vedanta teaching. But of course, it's the practical understanding that I and the Father are one. There are no two. You see, Jesus takes three positions. He takes the dualistic position, he takes the qualified non-dualistic position, the absolute non-dualistic position as well. He says, I am praying to my Father who is in heaven, dualistic position. Then he shifts, I am the vine and you are the branches. And then he shifts, I and the Father are one. These are not contradictory positions. These are stages in our spiritual evolution.
Thank you, Swami.
All right, we'll leave it there. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.